put this up here. Let's review yesterday first. Korean War. Actually, I'll go back then. Go back to our Korean War map. Hang on a sec. So, so in 1948, remember, the Korean Peninsula was formally divided into two separate nations, reflecting what would have been a temporary division between North and South. What was the formal name of the nation created in North Korea, let's say, first? Somebody tell me. Democratic People's Republic of Korea. DPRK. Okay. North Korea. Communist North Korea. Okay. And then in the South, simply the Republic of Korea. That's the non-communist capitalist democratic South. Okay, what's the line, the parallel line that divides the two? 38th parallel. All right, so then by June 25th, 1925, war erupted between the two when the North Koreans swept across the 38th parallel, pushed the South Koreans all the way back into a corner around 1950, sorry, June 25th, 1950. Thank you. Sorry about that. What's the city in the south? Busan. What's the capital of South Korea? Seoul. So the capital, and you should know where that is, located right up here, was overrun right away. They lost the capital basically immediately and were pushed all the way down to the south. Okay. Eventually, we don't need to review the whole thing. Back and forth they went. North Koreans swept south. UN, United States, comes to their aid, pushes North Korea north all the way almost to the Yalu River, that borders on China. Chinese communists get involved, push the South Koreans all the way back down south below the 38th. They eventually stop fighting, come to an agreement to cease fire, and the phrase that I introduced to you yesterday, what was it? Okay, so yeah, there's two terms. Stalemate, which I think most people have probably heard of before. That's simply a draw, right? A tie. And that's what this war was. Status quo ante bellum. The state of things before the war. What was the state of things after the war? It was the same as the state of things before the war. Okay, another fancy pants way of saying stalemate. A draw. And this is what Korea looks like today. Okay, so let's turn our attention then today to Vietnam, and I think you'll see a lot of parallels. It's actually kind of amazing how many similarities there are between the war in Vietnam, another Cold War conflict, and the war in Korea. So remember, Korea is right here, the Korean Peninsula, between Japan and mainland China. Got a little bit of Soviet Union that's right there. So there's the Korean Peninsula. Vietnam is in Southeast Asia. It is south of China, located right here on the coast. So then if we zoom in, this is what it looks like. You know what it looks like. You did the map. So the story of Vietnam then, the road to war in Vietnam begins in 1954 when France abandoned its colony. Is that what your outline says? I never have it in front of me. Is French Indochina on there? Okay, so that's the name of that France gave its colony. It had a colony. You know what colonialism is, imperialism. We studied it earlier in the year. It's just another example of a European power having a colony in a faraway place. For France, it was called French Indochina, and it was roughly this. Actually extended into Cambodia, which we'll talk more about later, but you can just think of it roughly as the same as Vietnam. French Indochina. By 54, basically France decides to get out. Okay, part of the reason they decide to get out is they're tired of fighting the communists in Vietnam. Okay, in Vietnam, a rebellion had developed as early as the 50s. of communists based in the north, led by Ho Chi Minh. Okay? Ho Chi Minh is the name of the communist leader of the rebellion in Vietnam, not in Vietnam, in French Indochina still, yeah.
For some reason, it said he was a non-communist and communist leader. I think of it. I don't know.
I'm not sure. I don't remember that.
I do remember. The looking made it very confusing. He said he was non-communist, but he was communist.
Well, he said he was both nationalist and communist.
Okay.
He had once fought on both sides of a war.
Okay. He's Vietnamese. He loves Vietnam. In that regard, he's a nationalist. He believes that he knows what's best for Vietnam, that he has a proper vision for it. So in that regard, I imagine that's what they mean by him being a nationalist. He becomes a communist, possibly under the influence of Russia and China. But he's definitely a communist also. So Ho Chi Minh is basically causing France all kinds of problems in their colony, French Indochina. The communist rebels in the colony were known as the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh. Should I make these? Should I make this font bigger here? I don't suppose it could hurt. Whoa. Yeah, that's better. That's actually better. Okay, Viet Minh. The Viet Minh are the communist rebels in Vietnam. Okay, led by Ho Chi Minh. So the French. They dealt with this rebellion, tried to put it down, did not succeed. It dragged on. It was costing them money. France is tired of the whole thing. They get out, basically. They abandon their colony and leave it. Okay, so now the Vietnamese, in a way, are on their own in their internal war to figure out for themselves what their nation will look like. But the United States was interested in what was going on in Vietnam. Okay, we know this is the Cold War, right? It's 1954. So America has a certain way of looking at the world during the Cold War, right? They have a certain policy or approach to dealing with the potential spread of communism. What was the name of that policy? What would be the word that you would use to describe America's approach to dealing with communism in the world? Containment, okay? Laid out in the Truman Doctrine. And containment's really simple. It says that the United States will try to stop the spread of communism. Well, in Vietnam, there's the potential that communism will spread. Okay, it will spread to, it will be cemented in the north. It will be the dominant form of government in the south. And America wants to prevent this everywhere. Okay, in every single nook and cranny around the world, in every single place, the United States is going to try to stop the spread of communism. Another sort of idea that you should understand that American leaders adhere to is the idea or the theory called the domino theory. Okay, the domino theory. This is also quite simple. All you have to do is picture dominoes set up, right? We've all done this, I'm assuming, at home. If you have dominoes around as a kid, you get them out. You set them up. Right? You knock down the first one knocks down the next in a sequence. Imagine the world. Picture the world. Let's go back to the world map here. The theory is that when one country falls to communism, then there's a really good chance that the neighboring countries will fall to communism next. Yes?
So they won't fall communist by themselves, like they would get invaded and become communist.
Well, domino theory doesn't get into why they fall, just that they will. So let's say, to back it all the way back up to the original communist nation, the Soviet Union, all right? Russia falls to communism. What happens next? On the map here, just look at the map. China. Then what? North Korea. Then what? Maybe South Korea, but the United States stepped in and fought a war to try to prevent that from happening. You follow it, right? Step in and prevent the dominoes from falling. It's kind of a twist or a version on containment, or the Truman Doctrine, yes. Yes, you can think of it that way. And in fact, it was Greece in Europe. We didn't talk too much about this, but there was a potential that Greece would fall to the communists, and America was afraid then that Turkey would. So this is the theory that America's following, is that this is how this happens. And so if you want to stop the spread of communism, you have to get in there. I mean, think about, imagine you have one of those deals. You've seen these on YouTube videos and stuff where they have the guys that do the dominoes in the very elaborate patterns, like an entire huge room of dominoes set up. And they go up and down these things and spiral patterns and colors and all that, right? 9 gajillion dominoes. It takes 4 months to set them up. What if somebody accidentally, they're almost done setting them up, someone comes along and accidentally knocks over some of the dominoes and they start falling? What would you do if you were one of those dudes who had set all that up and were waiting for the big moment? How would you deal with that? No, I'm not saying how would you feel. I'm saying what would you do? No, you would. David.
You just, stop them from falling.
You see where they're going, and you run in there and you knock them over or something. You try to stop the dominoes from falling. And if you succeeded in that, right, cut it off in a way, cut that chain reaction off, you prevent the whole thing from going. That would be the thing to do. If you want to prevent all gajillion dominoes from falling, then you get in there and you stop the next one from falling. Okay? So this is the theory. This is the theory that the United States is going to follow in Vietnam. Okay? Because they don't want Vietnam to fall to communism, because if it does, according to domino theory, then maybe Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, and on and on and on and on, right? Okay, so this is why America is so interested in Vietnam. So South Vietnam, just to kind of set this up before we start talking about the war, we know that the North Vietnamese communists are led by Ho Chi Minh. What are they called, by the way? North Vietnamese communists? Viet Minh, the Viet Minh. The South Korea is led by a man named Ngo Dinh Diem. I don't speak Vietnamese. Yes, Ngo Dinh Diem. Okay. North, Ho Chi Minh. South, Ngo Dinh Diem.
It didn't say that in the book.
Yeah.
Oh, it did.
Yes. So here's another. So there's lots of terms here. So you have communists based in the north, led by Ho Chi Minh, called the Viet Minh. You also have communist guerrillas. Right? You know what guerrilla fighters are? We talked about this before. Guerrilla warfare?
Yes.
No, we haven't. We have guerrilla warfare. A guerrilla is a guerrilla fighter. Is a fighter who fights in the style of guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare is hit and run tactics. People who are hide because they're a smaller, less well-equipped force in a battle, right? A traditional army. They come from the forest and the buildings, and if it's in a city, they hide in the buildings and the alleys. If it's in the forest, it's in the trees. They jump out, they hit, and then they disappear. Okay, there are communist guerrilla forces in the South. They're called the Viet Minh, or sorry, the Viet Cong, or VC for short.
So they're like hidden in the South.
They're all over South Vietnam, and they're sort of embedded, kind of hidden in plain sight, though.
Sound like serial killers.
Well, not exactly serial killers, just rebels. I mean, look, to some extent, you could describe the American revolutionaries as guerrillas in the Revolutionary War. They were fighting a traditional army, the Redcoats, the British, who would line up with their tanks and their muskets, and they were very powerful, and the Americans were less well equipped. So they had to hide in the trees on the roadsides, shoot, hit, and run. Okay, so guerrilla warfare is a very common tactic in history when you have an inferior force. Okay, so fighting begins then. In August of 1964, the Americans begin sending troops to South Vietnam. The United States begins to send military aid to South Vietnam. Troops, soldiers, to help them fight. And this is really the beginning of America's participation in the Vietnam War. Over time, America escalates its participation in the war. Escalation is kind of the term that's often used to describe America in Vietnam. Escalation, right? It goes up over time. So more and more troops, in other words. More and more tanks and planes and guns. More and more men and materiel over time are sent to Vietnam. So that by 1968, there are more than 1.5 million American soldiers in Vietnam. 1.5 million American soldiers were in Vietnam by 1968. So here you have, it should have already struck you, should have already noticed, excuse me, the parallels between Vietnam and Korea, right? Communist North, non-communist South, divided on a parallel line. What's the parallel line in Vietnam? The 17th. You have the Americans backing the South in order to contain the spread of communism. You have a nation even just that's oriented kind of on a north-south axis. So lots of similarities. The communists in the North, you should understand, that is Ho Chi Minh, the Viet Minh, they were backed by the Soviet Union and China. Okay. Well, not publicly, not openly, but they absolutely did. They were providing the Viet Minh with lots of help. Money, assistance, guidance, weapons. Not troops. Okay? China didn't send troops to Vietnam. Russia didn't send troops, but they sent other forms of aid and assistance. So this is what you call a proxy war. Most of the conflicts in the Cold War are proxy wars. A proxy war. So who's really fighting in Vietnam? If you get right down to the bottom of it, who are the two powers in the Vietnam War, really? The Americans and the Russians, right? Those are the people who are really fighting. But who are they fighting? Are they directly shooting at each other? No, they're fighting through the two sides in Vietnam. The two sides are called proxies. The proxies are the people who are fighting on behalf of the big power behind the scenes. Does that make sense? So that's why we call this a Cold War, right? It's not a hot war. A hot war would be the U.S. and the Soviet Union shooting at each other. A Cold War is a war, a conflict, no doubt about it, a rivalry, a competition, but by other means, right? Through other countries or through other mechanisms. Okay. As the years go by in the Vietnam War, and we're skipping over all the details of the fighting, and that's completely fine with me, America could not achieve a clear victory. For various reasons, America had difficulty managing a decisive victory. They couldn't get the upper hand and decisively defeat the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh. And so the war drags on and on and on. It takes a lot longer than the American authorities had expected. It takes a lot longer as the years go by than the American public is willing to accept. So increasingly, back home in the United States, the American citizenry is unhappy about the Vietnam War. Okay? There's a draft. You know what a draft is? Okay, where all males of a certain age have to sign up, and if their name's drawn from a hat, they have to go fight. 18 to 35 or 40 or something like that. The rules changed different. What's that? Not exactly, but I mean, I guess I see some similarities. So for various reasons, more and more, the war became more unpopular back home, and America couldn't get a decisive victory, and it was costing a lot of money, and it was taking a long time. And so eventually the United States withdraws from the Vietnam War. By 1969, you see on your outline there, the United States had begun to withdraw troops. They had begun to take troops out of Vietnam with the intention of leaving the war completely, of quitting and backing out and stopping participation in the Vietnam War. By 1973, all U.S. troops were gone, and by 1975, the North Vietnamese took over the South. In other words, the communists of North Vietnam won. 73, U.S. troops are gone. By 75, the South has been defeated. So this war is often described as or characterized as a defeat by the United States. for obvious reasons, because they failed in their strategic goal of containing communism, of keeping it in the north, right? If that was the goal, that failed, because communism spread into South Vietnam. A slightly different way to look at it, and this is how I'm more inclined to look at this, is that while, yes, the United States did ultimately fail in its goal of containment, it did succeed in resisting, you might say, of forcing the other side to spend time and energy making it hard, basically, for communism to spread. Saying to the Soviet Union, if you ever try to spread into other countries, we're going to fight you every step of the way. And it's going to take a long time, and it's going to be really hard, and it's going to be really expensive. And we believe that in the long run, we're going to wear you out, basically. So I think that's a more nuanced and accurate way of looking at it. Either way, it's definitely felt like a defeat in the United States. That's a great example of the sort of dynamics of the Cold War that we've been talking about. Okay, let's turn our attention then to Southeast Asia after the war, just to mention a couple of things. What does it look like? Is that on your outline too? Just want to make sure. Okay, so post-war Southeast Asia. In Cambodia, you mark this on your map right here, Cambodia. Cambodia became communist too, okay? And so in 1975, you had this Cambodian, this communist regime set up. Regime is like a government, a rule, a reign. A communist regime in Cambodia was established in 1975. It was called the Khmer Rouge. Okay, the Khmer Rouge. That's the name of the communist state in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge was led by a dictator named Pol Pot. Okay? Pol Pot was a psychotic killer of epic proportions, right up there with all the baddies in communist history. Well, I mean, that's because of the language that he speaks. It's a common name. If he had had the chance to kill as many as Mao and Stalin did, he would have, but he was located in a relatively small backwater place, so he only got to kill 2 million of his Cambodian people. I know, I'm being sarcastic. It's awful. Yeah. Yeah, it's like, what is that? A quarter, nearly a quarter of the population. 25% of all people killed by Khmer Rouge, by Pol Pot, yeah.
Will we ever remember the dates and stuff?
Oh, not really, no. Just another data point to illustrate, to demonstrate the nature of communist regimes. This is how it is everywhere, okay? This is what communist dictators do. They commit genocide against their own people, consistently. I mean, think about the examples we looked at. I mean, I don't know how many examples one needs to be convinced that this is how it works. Soviet Union, mass murder, check. China, mass murder, even worse, believe it or not, in terms of numbers, check. North Korea, still a genocidal dictator, check. Vietnam, this is how they behaved in Vietnam. Cambodia, on and on and on. Okay, and it's really sad. Because I guess this is a part of the defeat in a way, right? This is the aftermath of the war. This is what the United States failed to prevent, in a way. This is what the United States was trying to prevent, is things like the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia. As for Vietnam itself, just to wrap this up, when South Vietnam fell to the communists, lots of Vietnamese people wanted to get out of Dodge, as they say. I think I would want to, given what we know about communists. That's not a place I would want to live. In fact, 1.5 million Vietnamese people tried to flee Vietnam from, say, 1975 forward, right, when it fell to the communists. They tried to get out. From 75 forward. 1.5 million Vietnamese attempted to flee. Many of them came to America. There was a period from 75 through the 80s where there are quite a few Vietnamese refugees trying to flee Vietnam that the United States took in. as one last kind of gesture to help the Vietnamese people to say, hey, wait, we tried to keep the communists out of your country. You feel threatened by them. If you can get to America, we'll try to help you. And so in Vietnam, like North Korea, looks the exact same way today. South Vietnam is communist today. Just like China is still communist. But also just like China, South Vietnam, all of Vietnam is communist, North and South. But like China, Vietnam has introduced some free market principles into their country. They allow a little bit of ownership of private property. They allow some buying and selling. They allow some profit. That's the only way for a communist country to survive, is to become less communist. Remember, we saw the original example of that in Russia with the NEP, the new economic policy. Lenin saved Russia by allowing it to be a little bit more free market oriented. Same thing in Vietnam. But even to this day, Vietnam is all communist. Okay. Questions? Do you think this worked with the two sides, the screens?